Cuba is preparing civilians for war with the United States. Not metaphorically, literally. State media now shows university students training with anti-aircraft guns. The government distributed survival guides for military aggression. And one of the most shocking developments came quietly. The CIA director landed openly in Havana. For decades, Cuba treated the CIA like the embodiment of American regime change. Now the agency's chief walked into Havana during the island's worst economic crisis in decades. At the same time, reports emerged that Washington may indict former Cuban leader Raúl Castro over the 1996 brothers to the rescue shootdown. That changes everything. Because in Havana, this no longer looks like sanctions. It looks like preparation for confrontation. And here is the dangerous part. Cuba today sits in a far weaker position than during the Cold War. The economy is collapsing. Fuel reserves are nearly gone. Blackouts stretch for hours every day. Food shortages continue spreading, but desperate states can become unpredictable states. And if tensions keep escalating, the Caribbean could suddenly become one of the world's most dangerous flashpoints again. For most people, Cuba still feels frozen in time. Old American cars, communist slogans, endless tensions with Washington. But the current crisis started accelerating after the United States tightened sanctions and energy restrictions earlier this year. Those measures targeted shipping, oil imports, and companies trading with Havana. The result hit Cuba immediately. The island depends heavily on imported fuel. Without it, power plants fail. Transportation collapses. Factories stop working. Today, many Cubans face rolling blackouts lasting most of the day. Hospitals struggle with medicine shortages. Food prices keep rising. Meanwhile, the Cuban government believes Washington wants something much bigger than economic pressure. The CIA director's visit shocked the Cuban political system because of history. For decades, Cuban leaders accused the CIA of trying to overthrow the revolution through sabotage, assassination plots, and covert operations. So when CIA Director John Ratcliffe arrived in Havana publicly, Cuban officials saw a message: Washington was escalating. And then came reports about possible criminal charges against Raúl Castro. That matters because Castro still symbolizes the Cuban Revolution itself. To many Cuban officials, indicting him would mean the United States no longer seeks negotiation. It seeks humiliation and regime collapse. And that fear explains why Cuba suddenly talks about war preparation again. The first major revelation here is this: Cuba's leadership believes the real target is regime change. Not policy concessions, not negotiations. The survival of the government itself. That changes how Havana responds. When governments fear economic pressure, they negotiate. When governments fear removal, they militarize. That is exactly what we now see. President Miguel Díaz-Canel recently declared that Cubans stand ready to give our lives for the revolution. State television now broadcasts military drills involving civilians. The government promotes what Fidel Castro once called the war of the entire population. This strategy does not rely on winning conventional battles. It relies on making invasion unbearably costly. Vietnam used similar logic against the United States. Afghanistan used it against the Soviet Union and later America. Even outdated weapons become dangerous when millions of civilians participate in resistance. And Cuba's geography helps. Dense cities, mountains, and coastal terrain complicate military operations enormously. But the real significance is psychological. The Cuban government wants Washington to understand one thing: any attempt at forced regime change could spiral into prolonged chaos. And that leads directly to the second major issue. The second revelation is that Cuba's collapse now creates risks far beyond Cuba itself. Because instability in Cuba never stays inside Cuba. If conditions worsen further, the United States could face a massive migration crisis across the Florida Strait. Remember the Mariel boat lift in 1980? Over 100,000 Cubans fled to Florida within months. Something even larger could happen today. Cuba's infrastructure already strains under pressure. Electricity shortages hurt water systems, food distribution, and public transportation simultaneously. Once states lose basic service capacity, social unrest accelerates fast. We already see warning signs. Recent protests erupted over blackouts and food shortages. Some demonstrators openly said they no longer fear the consequences. That is extremely dangerous for Havana. Authoritarian systems survive through control and predictability. Economic collapse destroys both, and if protests expand nationwide, Cuba's military becomes the decisive institution. Would the armed forces suppress unrest completely? Would factions emerge inside the elite? Would outside powers intervene politically or economically? Nobody knows. But every major geopolitical player watches carefully. Because Cuba sits only 90 miles from the United States. Which brings us to the third and biggest revelation. This crisis is no longer just about Cuba. It is about global power competition. American officials accuse Cuba of hosting Chinese and Russian intelligence facilities. Havana denies the accusations. But from Washington's perspective, Cuba increasingly looks like a strategic outpost for America's rivals. That matters because the world has changed dramatically since the Cold War. The United States now competes simultaneously with China, Russia, and Iran across multiple regions. And Washington increasingly views nearby adversarial influence as unacceptable, especially in the Caribbean. For China, Cuba offers geographic proximity to the United States. For Russia, it offers symbolic resistance against American dominance. For Cuba, both relationships provide economic and political survival. That triangle creates escalation risks, because once great powers attach strategic value to a crisis, compromise becomes harder. And this explains the CIA director's visit. Washington likely wanted to deliver a direct message, reduce hostile cooperation, or face harsher consequences. But pressure creates reactions. The more isolated Cuba becomes, the more it may depend on China and Russia. That could deepen exactly the partnerships Washington wants, weakened. And suddenly, a collapsing Caribbean island becomes part of a much larger geopolitical contest. The implications reach far beyond Havana. For Latin America, this crisis could revive fears of Cold War-style intervention politics. Many governments already distrust heavy American pressure campaigns in the region. For Europe, instability in Cuba could trigger another migration and humanitarian emergency near NATO territory. For China and Russia, Cuba offers an opportunity to distract and pressure Washington close to American shores. And for the United States, the risks are enormous. History shows regime change operations rarely end cleanly, especially when governments prepare populations for resistance beforehand. Right now, both sides appear trapped. Washington wants leverage. Havana wants survival. And when neither side wants to appear weak, escalation becomes much easier than compromise. The most important takeaway is this. Cuba's crisis no longer resembles a frozen Cold War dispute. It increasingly resembles a live geopolitical pressure cooker sitting 90 miles from the United States.